The practice of Digital India, Aadhaar operating model. This operating model outlines the actors involved in the Aadhaar authentication ecosystem. The following figure identifies the key actors in the Aadhaar authentication model, and it depicts the data flow in which the key actors could engage with each other. The brief description of key actors and the scenarios in which they engage with each other are indicated in the figure below. On the left extreme side, you see a Aadhaar holder who is the resident who will be using one of the devices such as biometric devices to authenticate himself, and this is offered by a agency called AUA or ASA, which is government appointed, and every request for authentication actually passes through this and reaches the UIDIS CIDR, and the response, whether yes or no, will come back to the end user. Stakeholders in the Aadhaar authentication ecosystem. The first stakeholder is Unique Identification Authority of India, or UIDIA. UIDIA is an authority established by central government to be known as Unique Identification Authority of India, is responsible for the process of enrollment and authentication and performs such other functions assigned to it under the Aadhaar Act. It is the overall regulator and overseer of the Aadhaar authentication system. It owns and manages the Central Identities Data Repository (CIDR) that contains the personal identity data (PID) of all Aadhaar holders. The second stakeholder in the Aadhaar authentication ecosystem is Authentication User Agency, or AUA. AUAs are agencies that use Aadhaar authentication to enable its services and connect to the CIDR through an Authenticated Service Agency (ASA). AUA may also engage more than one ASA. An AUA could also transmit authentication requests from other entities that are sub-AUAs under it. AUAs can also act as an aggregator offering authentication services to sub-AUAs below them, and may also offer value-added services such as multi-party authentication, MIS reports, and authorization to their sub-AUAs. An AUA enters into a formal agreement with UIDIA in order to access Aadhaar authentication. The third stakeholder in the Aadhaar authentication ecosystem is sub-AUA. It is an agency, entity, any legal entity registered in India desiring to use Aadhaar authentication to enable its services could access Aadhaar authentication services through an existing AUA. The following are some of the possible examples. Government of any state or union territory could become an AUA, and several ministries and departments in the state could access Aadhaar authentication services through the state government as its sub-AUAs. A small entity or business, example a small scale bank, which does not want to directly engage in a formal agreement with UIDIA but still wants to use Aadhaar authentication, may choose to access Aadhaar services as a sub-AUA of an existing AUA, that is a large bank or an aggregator of AUA offering AUA services. Several entities could combine under a single AUA for business reason. Example, several hotels could access Aadhaar authentication as sub-AUA of an hoteliers association that becomes an AUA. In all such cases, UIDIA has no direct control contractual relationship with the sub-AUA. Only the AUA is contracted to UIDIA and shall be responsible for all authentication requests flowing through it, including those originating from its sub-AUAs. Upon appointment of a sub-AUA, an AUA need to share the copy of agreement between AUA and sub-AUA with UIDIA. AUA is liable to share the details of sub-AUA such as sub-AUA organization details, business scope, code, and etc. The fourth stakeholder in the Aadhaar authentication ecosystem is the requesting entity. A requesting entity means an agency or a person that submits the Aadhaar number and demographic information or biometric information of an individual to Central Identities Data Repository (CIDR) for authentication. The next element in the authentication system is the authentication devices. These are the devices that collect PID, personal identity data, from Aadhaar holders, encrypt the PID block, transmit the authentication packets, and receive an authenticated results. For example, includes PCs, kiosk, handheld devices, etc. They are deployed, operated, and managed by AUAs and sub-AUAs. The next and the sixth important stakeholder in the Aadhaar authentication system is the Aadhaar number holders. These are the individuals who have been issued Aadhaar number as per the Aadhaar Act. They seek to authenticate their identity towards gaining access to services offered by the AUA. The key actors could engage with each other in multiple ways. For example, an AUA could choose to become its own ASA, or an AUA could access other authentication services through multiple ASAs for reasons such as business continuity planning. An AUA transmits authentication requests to its own service delivery needs as well as on behalf of multiple sub AUAs. More details regarding the key actors, their roles, responsibilities, and obligations, and how they engage with each other in other authentication ecosystem can be available at this following URL. Federated Model of Aadhaar Authentication Service UIDAI offers Aadhaar authentication that can be used alone or in conjunction with AUA's domain or application specific authentication schemes called federated authentication. For example, in federated authentication, a bank could choose to use an ATM card and a fingerprint for authentication, of which the ATM card is authenticated within bank's application, whereas the fingerprint is authenticated against data in the CIDR using Aadhaar authentication. Most current authentication systems can be described as local, that is, pertaining to and are valid for few services, situations, or entities, and are revocable, wherein an existing identity factor could be revoked and reissued as a result of expiry, compromise, or other valid reasons. Aadhaar authentication system, on the other hand, could be described as global because of its applicability across AUAs and services, and non-revocable because other identity factors such as fingerprints and iris scans cannot usually be revoked or replaced. In the federated authentication model, the global irrevocable Aadhaar authentication coexists with and strengthens the local revocable authentication of AES. Such a federated approach would result in authentication systems that are stronger and more reliable than those that are based either only on global irrevocable model or only local revocable model. While the federated model does not mandate the existence or use of an AUS own authentication, if an AUA or sub-UA so wishes, they could use only Aadhaar authentication by itself. AUAs and sub-UAs are encouraged to use Aadhaar authentication in conjunction with their existing authentication to render the overall authentication system stronger and more reliable. Now let us look at Aadhaar authentication offerings. The below list depicts the various Aadhaar authentication offerings by UIDAI. Type 1 authentication. Through this offering, the service delivery agencies can use Aadhaar authentication system for establishing identity of an Aadhaar number holder by matching his or her Aadhaar number and his or her demographic attributes such as name, gender, date of birth, etc. In the type 2 authentication, offering allows services delivery agencies to authenticate Aadhaar number holders through one-time password delivered to their mobile number and or email address that is registered with UIDIA and available in CIDR. In the Type 3 authentication offering, service delivery agencies can authenticate Aadhaar number holders using one of the biometric modalities, either iris or fingerprint. In type number 4 authentication is a two-factor authentication offering with OTP as one factor and biometrics, either iris or fingerprint, as the second factor for authenticating the residents. In the type 5 authentication offering allows service delivery agencies to use OTP, fingerprint and iris together for authenticating residents. The following picture depicts all the types of Aadhaar authentication offerings. Type 1 demographic authentication, type 2 OTP authentication, type 3 biometric fingerprint or iris authentication, type 4 two-factor authentication OTP plus fingerprint or iris, type 5 in which three-factor authentication OTP plus fingerprint plus iris. During Aadhaar authentication process, the Aadhaar number needs to be submitted in all forms of authentication so that this operation is reduced to 1:1 match. Aadhaar number itself is not an authentication factor. Type 1 authentication may be combined with any other authentication offering. Service delivery agencies should select the appropriate authentication type based on their business requirements. They would need to balance out the resident convenience and service delivery risk before finalizing the authentication offering. Any further information on this can be got by visiting UIDA website and getting linked to this following URL.